Chapter 691. Nolan subconsciously secured her tightly in his arms as he pressed his warm lips on her forehead. 2 days later, the name Maisie appeared on Google Trends as expected. The news about Maisie being beaten up by someone's first wife on the street was widely discussed amongst the socialites. Maisie shut her phone down and set it aside. Someone knocked on the door, and Maisie lifted her head. It was one of her female employees, and she said, "Come in." The female employee came in with a document in her hand. "Ms. Vanderbilt, a model wishes to become the spokesperson for our line of jewelry that is dedicated to couples. Here is her profile that they sent us." Maisie took over the document. And she was slightly surprised when she saw who she was. The name on the profile was none other than Zyla Mayweather. The woman in the photo had a highly recognized face. Although she wasn't someone who was stunningly beautiful at first glance, her appearance was unforgettable. Her official height was 5 feet 7 inches. She was considered tall and was a perfect match for Lewis, who stood at 6 feet 2 inches. However, Maisie wondered why she wanted to become the spokesperson for Seoul as soon as she came back from overseas. The female employee asked, "Are you going to sign her?" Maisie placed her profile back into the document and said, "Tell them that I still need some time to consider." After the female employee left and just when Maisie was about to start doing her work, a tall and eye-catching figure appeared outside of the door. Maisie was stunned. "Cousin? I just received his ex-girlfriend's profile, and now he's here. What a coincidence." Lewis stepped into the office and said, "I just had something for you." Smiling, Maisie replied, "What a coincidence. Zyla just sent in her profile and requested to be the spokesperson for Seoul. If my memory served me right, she's your ex-girlfriend, right?" Lewis was stunned for a moment. Although he tried his best to keep himself calm, Maisie could still notice the hint of panic on his face. "She wants to become the spokesperson for Seoul Jewelry?" Maisie rested her chin on her hand and replied, "You still can't forget her?" "Nope," Lewis replied without any hesitation. He paused for a long while before adding, "It's none of my business whether or not she wants to be the spokesperson for your company. The line she is interested in is the jewelry for couples. What if she wants to work with you?" Maisie asked as she looked fixedly at Lewis. Although Lewis was her cousin, Riley was her bestie. So she figured that she needed to sound him out first. Lewis chuckled and replied, "Except for the time you asked me for help 3 years ago, I won't take any more endorsements, and I won't do it this time either, okay?" Knowing that Lewis had realized her intention, Maisie did not say anything anymore. She picked up a document and asked, "By the way, did you want to see me for something?" Louise sat on the couch in front of him. "I just wanted to ask you about the matter of Riley getting kicked out of the club in university." Maisie stopped flipping through the document. She lifted her head and looked at him. "How did you know that?" Lewis looked at her calmly and replied, "I've run a background check on her. I know she was the president of the orchestra club when she was in university." Maisie fell silent. Riley wasn't only good in altercations. She seemed like a loser who was good at nothing, but in fact, she was talented in art. It was only because of the incident back in university that she had been dispirited for so many years. If that incident had not happened, Riley would have been a national-level musician by now that could stand toe-to-toe with Lewis, who also came from a musical family. Maisie had not been surprised when she first learned of the marriage between the Hills and the Lucases. After all, the Hills and the Lucases had been on good terms for years, and secondly, Riley and Lewis were considered to be in the same circle. Maisie took a deep breath and asked, "You didn't mention it in front of Riley, did you?" "Nope. I tried to, but she seemed rather not happy about it," Lewis said. "In fact, I've watched her performance before." Chapter 692. Maisie was stunned. "When did that happen?" Lewis replied without any hesitation, "I was there during your high school party that year." It had been so long that Maisie had forgotten about it. She looked at Lewis intently. Honestly, she was kind of surprised that he was able to find out about Riley getting kicked out of the club when he was in university. Just how deep did he look into this? As if she remembered something, she smiled at Louis and said, I can tell you. But you have to answer my question first in exchange. With a smile etching on her face, she continued, why do you want to marry Riley? Hashtag the supermodel Zyla has returned from overseas. Hashtag Riley was sitting with her legs crossed on the couch while eating a bowl of fruit salad. When she was scrolling through her Facebook newsfeed, she saw the news, and her eyes were fixed on the screen for a long time. Zyla has returned? Since his ex-girlfriend is coming back. Does this mean that we don't need to continue our marriage anymore? She thought as she picked up a piece of watermelon with a fork. Russell came downstairs in a hurry and shouted, Riley, you brat. Her hand trembled, and the watermelon in front of her dropped to the floor. Before she had time to mourn for the loss, she saw her father pacing in the living room. Whenever her father started pacing, she knew he was looking for something to beat her. She hastily put the bowl of fruit on the table and jumped up. What are you doing? Dad? You still have the nerve to ask me that. Russell growled as he rolled his sleeve up, his face livid with rage. Where is that antique pocket watch that I keep in the study room? What antique pocket watch? Do you have any idea how much that pocket watch costs? $90,000. Russell shouted. Riley's brain went blank for a moment, and it was only then she remembered which antique her father was talking about. I've been keeping it for 20 years. I didn't even dare to touch it. When I was packing my stuff today, he was fuming with rage as he said, my $90,000 is gone. Riley swallowed hard and forced an embarrassed smile on her face. Oh, so that pocket watch is an antique. I didn't know about that, oh gosh. I'm in big trouble this time, Riley thought. She had sold the pocket watch 9 years ago to help Maisie. After all, her father had a lot of collections. He rarely took them out, so she did not expect him to go look for the pocket watch for so many years. Russell let out 2 dry smiles. He walked up to her and said, if I had known that you would grow up into such a prodigal daughter, I would have. He raised the broom in his hand high in the air. Riley was so startled that she jumped down from the couch and dashed toward the door without even wearing her slippers. She opened the door and saw Louis standing in front of the door, holding the broom. Russell chased after her. Stop running, you brat. However, when he saw Louis, he quickly put the broom down and smiled at him. Huh? Louis? What brought you here today? Riley felt wronged after seeing her father's attitude change when facing Louis. Dad, if you can be so gentle to me, I'm willing to give up 10 years of my life. Sneering, Russell replied, if you stop giving me so much trouble, I'm willing to give up 20 years of my life. Louis chuckled and said, I hope I am not bothering you, Mr. Hill. Russell put the broom down and waved his hand. Of course. You're not. We're going to become a family soon, and you're always welcome to pay me a visit. As he was talking, he put his hand on Louis's shoulder. Come, don't just stand here. Come in and have a seat. I just bought some nice tea. Since I'm free today, let's enjoy some tea and play chess together. Louis smiled and entered the house with Russell. Riley stamped her feet in frustration outside of the door. How could he do this to me? I'm his daughter. Chapter 693. Russell brought Louis into the study room. After they took their seats in front of the table, he asked the maid to bring them the tea. Louis scanned around the study room. The study room had rather simplistic and classic decoration. All of the books displayed on the shelves ranged from classical to modern titles. It seemed to him that the Hills were indeed worthy of being a scholarly family in Bassburg. After the maid served the tea, Louis stopped Russell when he was going to pour him the tea. He said, let me do it. Mr. Hill. Russell chuckled and replied, it's okay. After pouring the tea, he sighed. I'm sorry for what happened today. Holding the cup of tea in his hand, Lewis said, You were tough on Riley. But I know that you never hit her hard, no matter how angry you were with her. Russell let out a bitter smile. It was true that he had beaten Riley a lot of times, but he never beat her hard. After all, she was his only daughter, and he doted on her a lot. He sighed. It's true that I didn't dare to beat or scold her too hard in the past, but she has been so rebellious since she graduated that I can't stop worrying about her. I'm worried that she might go down the wrong path and get in trouble. I'm sure that you know she has a fiery temper. And when it's time for her to get married, Riley was pressing herself against the door to eavesdrop on the conversation between Lewis and her father. Then, she heard the word get married. Just when she was about to enter the study room to end the conversation. Even if her father was going to beat the hell out of her, Lewis's voice rang out. He said, I'm not trying to stick my nose into your family affairs, Mr. Hill, but in my opinion, you don't have to worry about that. Even if I get married to Riley in the future, I can accept her for who she is. Riley was stunned and loosened her hand that was gripping tightly on the handle. Lewis, are you sure about that? Can you really accept Riley? Russell asked, his voice filled with surprise. After all, it was Larissa who had brought up this arrangement. He was worried about whether his daughter could get married, and was happy to have someone willing to marry her. It was just that he was worried that no one could handle his daughter's temper like him. Lewis smiled faintly and said, I know Riley isn't as incompetent as she seems. She's a gem that hasn't been polished. Russell was stunned for a moment, and then he chuckled. You're right. I've almost forgotten how talented and great she used to be. Suddenly, he recalled something and got up to his feet. He went to the table behind him and pulled a photo album out of the drawer. After that, he returned to his seat and flipped the photo album open slowly. Riley had been a pretty and elegant girl since she was a kid. She had a graceful air about her. And she used to be very talented in all kinds of things such as painting, chess playing, music, and so on. Most of Riley's photos had been taken on the stage. She was either wearing her performance dress or a costume. A few photos showed her playing violin and piano on the stage. She also had taken opera singing from a tutor, and she had performed on stage since she was 7. Lewis flipped the photo album toward the last few pages. There are a few photos of the backstage of the high school party, and there was this particular photo showing 3 people. Riley was standing in the center. On the left was Maisie, while Lewis had never seen the boy on the right before. However, he was familiar with this photo. Mr. Hill, can you give this photo to me? Russell was stunned for a moment before nodding. Sure. You can have it. After all, she doesn't know about the existence of this photo. Riley barged in before Russell could finish his sentence, and nearly spilled his tea. She looked at the photo album silently. Russell hastily put the cup down and put the photo album out of Riley's sight. Then, he said, Where are your manners, Riley? How can you not knock on the door? Riley stretched her arm forward and said, Give me the photo album. Chapter 694. Riley chased her father to the door and shouted, Dad. However, Russell paid her no mind. He went back into his room and locked the door. Lewis stayed in the study room and looked at Riley, who was standing outside. After a short while, Riley stormed in and grabbed him by his collar. What the hell do you want, Lewis? How dare you investigate me? Lewis replied calmly, Do you have any secrets that can't be known to others? Riley did not say anything in return. He removed her hand and dusted his collar. After that, he rose to his feet and looked down at her. Do you think it's your fault for what happened that year? Riley froze. She clenched her fists tightly and asked, What do you mean? Lewis leaned closer to her and said, I don't believe that you're that kind of person. After that, He left the study room, leaving Riley to stand frozen stiff on the spot as she was overwhelmed by a surge of despair. At Black Gold, Maisie passed by the reception desk. The staff at the front desk already knew her identity, and she greeted her warmly. "You've come, Mrs. Goldman." "Mr. Goldman is in his office." She smiled at her and nodded. "Thank you." Maisie walked toward the office and knocked on the door. After getting permission, she pushed the door open and saw Nolan was reading a document in his chair. He did not raise his head, so he thought she was Quincy. He said, "Please help me to inform them that I'm not going to the event tonight. I don't like that kind of occasion." Maisie walked toward the desk and leaned forward. "Why, though?" Stunned, Nolan closed the document and raised his head. "Z?" Maisie got up and sat beside the desk. "Are you surprised?" He put the document on the desk, got up to his feet, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of her. "Are you here to entertain me?" "Entertain me?" Nolan was stunned as soon as the words slipped past his lips. He did not expect himself to say something like that. It just came out of his mouth naturally. Maisie stroked his cheek and said, "Well, you caught me." Nolan grabbed her wrist and put her palm against his cheek. Did I always say something like that in the past?" Blinking her eyes, Maisie replied, "Do you want to hear a joke?" "Nolan?" Nolan lifted his eyebrows and looked at her. There was a sugar cube walking in the North Pole. It felt so cold, and then it turned into an ice cube. Nolan rubbed his chin against her palm and finished her sentence. There was a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Maisie withdrew her hand and said, "A cabbage was taking off its clothes as it walked." Nolan chimed in again and said, "And then it was gone." Maisie frowned. "Have you gotten your memories back?" He kissed her and replied, "I was exposed to these dry jokes in high school." Maisie was rendered speechless. Then why didn't he know the answer back then? Maisie thought. However, she soon found the reason why. After all, he now only had the memories of the things that had happened before he was 17, so of course, he could remember the things that happened in his high school better. Maisie jumped down from the desk and stood in front of him. "This is so boring." Nolan grabbed her into his arms and buried his head in her shoulder. "Did you tell me these dry jokes in the past as well?" "Z?" "Yeah," Maisie replied. He turned her over and forced her to meet his gaze. "I can remember some of it." Nolan scratched the tip of her nose with his finger and asked, "What brought you here today?" "Is it because you miss me too much?" Maisie turned her face sideways and said, "Yeah. But I don't miss you anymore." He chuckled deeply at her answer. Quincy knocked on the door, and Maisie pushed Nolan away. When Quincy entered the office, he was taken aback slightly when he saw Maisie. "I didn't know you were here too." "Ms. Vanderbilt." An impish smile appeared on Maisie's face as she said, "Mr. Goldman said he'll attend the dinner tonight." Nolan pinched her cheek and sighed exasperatedly. "You really are one naughty woman." Maisie smiled at him and replied, "It's okay. You can go to entertain your client." Then, she went closer to him and whispered into his ear. "However, come back early. I'll be waiting for you at home, and then we'll take a bath together." Chapter 695. Nolan loosened his tie and said to Quincy, "I'm not going to the dinner tonight. Tell them that I have to take a bath with my wife." Quincy was rendered speechless. At night, Maisie regretted everything she had said in the afternoon. The ripples were reflecting on the ceiling. The bathroom was foggy, and it was only when the residual heat faded that her vision became clear. She leaned on Nolan's chest and listened to his heartbeat. His body gave off a refreshing smell after he took a bath. And the beads of salty sweats that glided off his body looked like rivulets of light. "Are you really not going to attend the dinner?" she asked. He lifted her wet hair and collected them behind her back. "I didn't want to go in the first place. Besides, Isn't it more important to stay with my wife than to socialize? Maisie was tickled pink by his answer. She got up and wrapped the towel around her body. After that, she took the hair blower and walked to the wash basin to dry her hair. Nolan approached her and took the hair blower away from her. He helped her dry her hair, and as he ran his fingers over her hair, he said, "From now onward, I'll help you dry your hair, Z." Maisie looked at him and said, "Nolan." "There's one thing." Nolan switched off the hair blower and looked at her. "Yeah?" Turning around, Maisie lifted her head to meet his gaze, but she did not say anything. Although she did not say anything, he knew she wanted to ask for help from him through her eyes. "Do you want me to help you with something?" Maisie blinked her eyes. He poked her cheek and continued. "You don't have to go to the extent of inviting me for a bath if you have a favor to ask. You can just tell me." "I thought you just wanted to take a bath with me." Maisie pushed his hand away and replied, "I was just kidding." "Who knew you'd take it so seriously?" He raised his brows. "Well, what's done cannot be undone." Maisie decided not to beat around the bush anymore. She was reluctant to tell him about it because she did not know how to tell him. After all, that person was somewhat connected to his mother. "Mr. Topaz was once your mother's agent, right?" The smile on the tip of Nolan's lips froze, and his face sank. He replied flatly. "Why are you asking about him?" Maisie knew that it was a taboo to talk about his mother right now since he had lost his memories. However, Anthony had once been his mother's agent. Besides, Maisie was curious about everything that Lewis had told her today. She had heard about the things that happened to Riley that year. However, she had not asked her about it since she did not want to make Riley go through the trauma again. The reason Lewis would know about it was that he had looked into the matter himself. Nolan put the hair blower down and gathered the few strands of wet hair that stuck to her cheek. "Just tell me what you want." Maisie opened her mouth slightly and asked, "Mr. Topaz has a daughter named Naomi, right?" Nolan squinted his eyes and replied, "I guess so." "Why are you asking?" "She and Riley joined the same club when they were in university." "I heard that." Maisie lowered her head to look at her toes. "She's in a coma now." Riley had been kicked out of her club back then because the Royal Academy of Music only offered one spot for the students who joined the orchestra club at Northwest University. Both Riley and Naomi had been the ace students in the orchestra club. However, when they had been competing against each other in a performance, Naomi fell from the stairs, and Riley was the only one who was with her at that time. Riley had been accused as the culprit who pushed Naomi down the stairs. After the incident, Anthony, the gold medal agent at the Royal Academy of Music, had used his connections to get the school to cancel Riley's application. After that, Riley was kicked out of the club because they all thought she was the one who had pushed Naomi down the stairs. Christina, Riley's aunt, had stepped forward, and it was only then that scandal and news were put to an end. However, Riley had not touched music since then. She had withdrawn from Northwest University and cut off all her connections with her friends. Chapter 696. What had happened back then had undoubtedly left a huge emotional scar on Riley. It was so unbearable to her that not only had she avoided music, but she also avoided getting into contact with any musical instrument all this while. Nolan was startled. It was obvious that to him, the incident that had happened between Riley and Naomi Topaz had not taken place yet, and he had no memory of his event. Maisie took his hand, lifted his head, and gave off a faint smile. "Since you know Mr. Topaz, can you find a chance to introduce me to him? I wish to meet him in person." Nolan lifted her up, placed her on the edge of the wash basin, and pressed his firm chest against hers. "After sweet-talking me for so long, all you wish is to see him?" Maisie pursed her lips. "Then, will you help me?" He kissed her ear and lowered his voice. "That depends on my wife's performance." The night was silent, and the gray curtain draping on the French windows swayed with the wind. Maisie performed from midnight to dawn, and Nolan enjoyed it to the fullest, conquering her from the beginning to the end and showing no sign of exhaustion. As the sky was getting brighter, Nolan hugged the person sleeping in his arms and affectionately caressed her blushing cheeks with his palms. He did not sleep and waited until 6 a.m. He then rolled over, sat up, put on his nightgown, grabbed his cell phone, and left the room. He then called Quincy at the entryway. It was already 10:30 a.m. when Maisie woke up. She rushed downstairs after freshening herself in a hurry and found out that Alfred had already prepared breakfast for her. She finished her breakfast and asked Alfred, "When did Nolan leave this morning?" Alfred replied with a smile, "Mr. Goldman went out at 7 a.m. Today." 7 a.m.? That fella spent the whole night tossing me around on the bed and didn't even sleep before leaving for work. Maisie rushed to Soul Jewelry and received a text message from Quincy while she was on her way, saying that Mr. Topaz would be attending a charity banquet tomorrow night, and Nolan would bring her along to the venue. She looked at the screen, and the corners of her lips could not help but twitch. It seems that my hard work from last night hasn't gone to waste. The receptionist at the front desk walked up to her as soon as she stepped into the company. "Ms. Vanderbilt, Ms. Mayweather has been waiting for you in the reception lounge for quite some time already." Maisie was slightly astounded. Zyla Mayweather actually came in person? But that's great. It just so happens that I want to know why she can't wait to collaborate with us too. After all, as one of the top-tier models, she can always find a more well-known company, like Taylor Jewelry, instead of Soul Jewelry if she wants to get into jewelry endorsement. Maisie came to the door of the reception lounge and was about to push the door and get in when she heard a man's voice. "I just don't understand. Soul Jewelry is only a new brand, so why would you want to get into a collaboration with this small company? Not to mention that the owner is quite full of herself. Is she making us wait for so long on purpose?" However, the woman who responded to him sounded rather calm. Soul Jewelry is a brand founded by one of the world's best designers, Zora. And let's not forget that it's also a jewelry company owned by the Black Gold Group. It has potential. So what? You're blessing them with your name and fame the moment you claim that you're willing to collaborate with them. But what they're doing now clearly shows that they're not interested in the formation of this relationship. As soon as the man finished speaking, Maisie pushed the door open and walked in. The woman sitting on the couch with her tea looked graceful and sophisticated. She really did live up to her reputation as a model. Maisie smiled and walked up to them. "Sorry, something came up, and there was a delay." Maisie then sat down on the couch. Zyla put down the teacup and replied politely, "Don't worry, we haven't waited for too long." "That's understandable." However, the male assistant who was sitting beside her scoffed and expressed disdain. Maisie ignored him and went straight to the point. "It's our fault for not extending a warm welcome to you, Ms. Mayweather. I hope you'll be able to forgive us for that. Of course, I have to make things clear before we start discussing the details. The reason we didn't agree to your collaboration request at once isn't that we disparage your worth and status. After all, Ms. Mayweather's endowment and influence in the field is not something that we see in any other models." Chapter 697. However, I want to know why you would choose to collaborate with Soul Jewelry, a brand that's still a novice in this field. You obviously have a lot of better choices. Zyla looked at Maisie. "Because I like Soul Jewelry's design inspiration. I can see the soul that your jewelry designs possess as I've seen the masterpieces that you put out while you were working for Luxella before this. They look and feel different from those soulless pieces that only had magnificent-looking shells." Maisie lowered her gaze and chuckled. "It's my honor to be able to meet you. You definitely know how to appreciate my designs, Ms. Mayweather." Zyla smiled. "Of course, but there's another reason." Maisie narrowed her eyes as Zyla said meaningfully. "I heard that Louis made an exception to shoot a promotional advertisement for Soul Jewelry 3 years ago. A brand that Louis endorses won't be bad, right?" Maisie and Zyla exchanged gazes. She just disclosed that the other reason she's chosen to go into a collaboration with Sol is Lewis's previous endorsement from 3 years ago. It seems that she's bringing this up deliberately just to remind me of her previous relationship with Lewis. My relationship with the de Armas hasn't been made public. Noon knows that I'm Lewis's cousin except those people that are close to me. On the other hand, she seems so open and honest while she admitted the real reason she has chosen to collaborate with us. And she doesn't even sound aggressive when saying so. It's obvious that she doesn't think of me as her rival in love. Even if she doesn't know about my relationship with Lewis, she should know about Nolan and me as long as she surfs the internet. Maisie pretended to be surprised. I heard that Mr. Lucas has an ex-girlfriend who works as a model. It seems that you're her, Ms. Mayweather. Zyla sounded neither humble nor arrogant. Not many people know about my past relationship with Lewis, but you're the missus of the Goldmans. So you should be able to meet Lewis quite frequently. By the way, I heard that Lewis has gotten engaged, and his fiancée is the daughter of the Hills? Ms. Mayweather, you do still care a lot about your ex's affairs, huh? Maisie rubbed her fingers as she looked seemingly nonchalant. Zyla blinked. Of course. He was the one who broke up with me back then, causing me heartbreak. That's why I'm here to stay this time around. She asked her assistant for the document and placed it on the desk as she said that. After I sign the contract and get into a collaboration with Sol Jewelry, I can guarantee that your company will see its highest sales volume within a year. Not to mention that I won't even ask for a higher payment, I'll only ask your party for 15% of my ordinary advertising fees. And I only ask for one condition in return. Zyla left Sol Jewelry with her assistant, and Maisie was still sitting on the couch with an indifferent expression. An employee then entered the lounge. Ms. Vanderbilt, since Ms. Mayweather is willing to lower her terms. Would you like to think about it? Zyla is a well-known supermodel, and she has already set foot in the entertainment industry. It's said that she has already gotten her hands on all the resources that she can find in the industry. If she were to collaborate with Sol, it'd indeed bring the company a lot of popularity and sales. However, Maisie pursed her lips tightly. She wants me to get Riley to cancel her engagement with Lewis. She raised her hand to cover her eyes and brows and stared at the document on the desk through the seam in between her fingers. It's no wonder Zyla would find her way to Sol as soon as she returned to Zlokova. She already knows about my identity and has already looked into Lewis and Riley's engagement. Naturally, she knows that I'm Riley's best friend. She's named such attractive terms and conditions deliberately as if she's trying to sell me a huge favor, but in fact, she's trying to start a rivalry against Riley. The employee next to her whispered, Ms. Vanderbilt? Maisie returned to her senses, put the document on the desk away, and stood up. It's truly rare for her to name such fascinating terms. But she stopped by the employee's side and handed the document to her. Sol will not be led by the nose by someone else. Get someone to inform Ms. Mayweather, saying that if she plans to collaborate with us, because of personal reasons, I'm afraid that I can't accept her offer. Chapter 698. Barbara and Riley were shopping for luxury goods, and Riley was absent-minded throughout the whole process. Barbara had to call her out a few times before she responded. What's on your mind? Riley curled her lips and rubbed her stomach all of a sudden. I'm hungry. Shall we go for dinner now? Barbara laughed. Didn't we just eat at noon? She was flustered for a moment. Is that so? Barbara's cell phone rang when she was about to say something. She then picked up the call when she saw that it was from Maisie. Riley and I are in the mall now. She? Her phone ran out of battery and died. What? Barbara ended the call with a troubled expression on her face after the exchange of a few more sentences. Thus, Riley asked, what happened? Why did Z call you? Barbara lifted her eyelids, looked at her, and placed her hand on Riley's shoulder. You're in trouble. Riley looked puzzled. Barbara and Riley rushed to Soul Jewelry. Riley had already learned about the situation through the phone, so she asked as soon as she entered the room through the door, "Zyla Mayweather. What does she mean?" Maisie was sitting on the couch and took a sip of coffee. "What I told you is what she means. The only condition that she's named to get her to collaborate with Soul is for me to get you to cancel your marriage engagement with Louis." She then put down the cup. She doesn't plan to leave Zlokova again after returning here this time around. She should have a long-term career development plan all planned out already. Barbara snorted. She can't get her mind off her ex, so she has come back here to rekindle her relationship with Mr. Lucas now that she knows he has gotten engaged. After saying so, she looked at Riley, who had yet to utter a single word. "Do you need me to get someone to help you deal with this woman?" Riley crossed her arms and said disapprovingly. "Why would I need your help? Isn't this even better? Besides, I didn't say that I'd definitely marry him." Barbara propped her elbows on her shoulders. "Don't worry, I'll support you no matter what's your final choice." Maisie's gaze shifted around the room and was then fixed on Riley for a long time. How this matter will end depends solely on Louis. Zyla might not be able to get her mind off her past relationship, but it doesn't mean that Louis shares the same thought as she does. And since Louis has agreed to the marriage, it means that he's not the kind of man who would marry a woman so casually. Riley looked at her blankly. "Z, since when did you start to know your cousin so well?" She smiled. "Yesterday." Riley stopped talking. As soon as the word yesterday was mentioned, she could not help but think of what Louis had said the previous night, and it felt extremely irritable. At that moment, on the other side of the city, Zyla came to the Royal Academy of Music, and an academic staff member brought her to the performance hall. While in the corridor, they could already hear the melodious violin that originated from the hall. The huge performance hall was empty, and the lights were very dim. There was only a bright white spotlight on the stage, and it was pointing at the man in white, who was playing the violin. Louis was tall, and his tall and straight back was reflected in the mirror. The white velvet shirt was draping against his chest, and the first two buttons from the collar were unbuttoned, which made him look extremely flamboyant yet cold and indifferent at the same time. He looked like a dazzling light while performing on the stage as his flawless figure found its way into Zyla's eyes. "Isn't this the exact scene that attracted me to him on stage back then?" Seeing the woman slowly walking onto the stage in the mirror, Louis stopped moving. And the melodic tune stopped altogether. He then put the violin down and turned to look at her. Zyla's eyes curved into two lines as she grinned. "Louis, did I catch you off guard with this surprise?" "I'm Hack." Louis did not respond and walked past her. Zyla grabbed him by his arm. But he did not look back. "You were the one who broke up with me 9 years ago. We had been in a relationship for 6 years back then. Don't you feel any reluctance at all?" Louis broke his arm free of her grasp and turned to look at her with an unconcerned expression. "We aren't compatible." Chapter 699. We're not compatible? Is that all I get? Zyla walked around and in front of him with bloodshot eyes. We had been together for 6 years. You love music, so I picked up the violin for you. I've always tried my best to get close to you, to walk into your heart. But what about you? All you did was trifle with my feelings for you. Louis's eyes looked moved. I'm sorry. I don't want your apology. Zyla hugged him. Louis, I can even become the kind of woman you like if you don't like the type of woman I am. You told me that you would try to accept me, but it's been 6 years now. I've never gotten into his heart, and all I got from him back then was a breakup and a mere we aren't compatible. I'm not reconciled to how things turned out. Louis pushed her away and quickly put down the hand that was grabbing her shoulder. You're fine, and there's no need for you to change. Just think of it as a favor that I owe you. I can make up for it with any other things. But I'm not worthy of your love and attention. He left the performance hall without looking back. Zyla's hands, resting on both sides of her body, could not help but clench tightly into fists. I was the one who courted Louis back then, but he rejected me, saying that I'm not his type. But I didn't care much about that, and I was willing to become the woman that's more his cup of tea. I even picked up basic violin skills and tried to learn to enjoy music because of him. On the other hand, he tried to accept me too. And I really thought I had a chance to impress him and even walk into his heart someday back then. However, throughout the 6 years that we were together, Louis could be heedful at times, but he could also be rather indifferent to me sometimes. He would smile at me when he was happy. But he could also ignore me as if I was invisible when he was not in the mood. I had been paying a lot of attention to Louis when I was abroad all these years. He had not been together with another woman ever since he broke up with me, and that's great news for me. After all, I'm the only ex-girlfriend that he's ever announced to the public, even though my title as his girlfriend seemed rather nominal. However, he got engaged to the daughter of the hills out of the blue 3 years ago. He once mentioned that he doesn't like that his family loves to make marriage arrangements for him on his behalf, but still, he compromised in the end. So how can I be reconciled? I have a better figure and more eye-catching looks. But what does that useless piece of trash have in comparison? She's won just because she has a marriage contract with Louis. The assistant called Zyla at this time and seemed to have told her that Sol Jewelry had declined her offer. Her expression changed a little. In the hospital, Maisie and Kennedy went on a stroll in the garden. Kennedy's arm injury was recovering well, and he had been able to take care of himself. It was said that he could be discharged from the hospital in a week. Some elderly people could be seen walking around, playing chess, and even sunbathing in the garden. Kennedy turned to look at her. Z. Aren't you afraid that Ms. Mayweather will make a fuss about it after rejecting her offer to endorse our products? Zyla had gotten rejected by Sol when she was willing to swallow her pride and offer to endorse Sol's products. In the eyes of an outsider, Sol would be crowned as an insensible and immodest company. Nonetheless, Maisie did not care. Whatever, I don't think she sincerely wants to get into a collaboration with Sol. I'm looking for a pure mutualistic relationship that promotes a win-win collaboration. Not a business relationship that has someone else's personal issues mixed in it. Personal issues? Kennedy was puzzled. Maisie smiled and gave it to him straight. She's my cousin's ex. And the only condition for her to endorse our products is for me to get Riley to cancel her marriage engagement with Louis. Do you think I'm someone who would do so? Only then did Kennedy realize. Ms. Mayweather wants to use your identity to facilitate the affairs between Mr. Lucas and her? Not necessarily. Maisie shook her head. She knows that Riley is my best friend, and she thinks she can restrain Riley through me. She thinks that I'll see how many benefits she can make for Sol after getting into a collaboration with her. And with that, I'll keep one eye shut and choose not to intervene when she makes a move on Riley in the future. Chapter 700. Zyla knows about my identity and wants to rule out the possibility I'll stop her from making a move on Riley. So she could only swallow her pride and offer to endorse Sol to ensure I'll choose not to intervene in her future plots. Kennedy chuckled. She thought you would value your company's benefits more than anything else. What's more, Sol is currently in development and needs to obtain more resources before it can arrive at a spot where Zyla's international influence will be of use to the company. They came to a pavilion and saw a small convenience shop nearby, so Maisie asked, Uncle Kennedy, would you like something to drink? Anything will do. Maisie went to the shop and bought 2 cans of lemon tea. But a boy came out of nowhere on a bicycle, and he did not seem to have noticed Maisie, who suddenly walked out of the sidewalk. A silhouette dashed up to her and pulled her out of the way in an instant. At the same time, the boy fell to the ground because of the sudden break. He was so frightened that he started crying. Maisie was stunned. She looked up immediately and saw Francisco. Francisco said to the boy, "Why are you crying? Don't you know that there are many people here? So why would you ride so fast around this place? What would you do if you were to run into someone?" The boy's cry intensified, which aroused the passers-by's dissatisfaction. "He's still a kid. How could you scold him like this? So I should condone his behavior just because he's a kid?" Francisco's face looked expressionless. "You people can stand right there and comment on how strict and inhumane I am only because you're not the one who almost got hit by him. So are you going just ignore or admit that you've run out of luck if you're the one who got implicated by this boy's recklessness?" The passers-by who spoke up for the boy seemed not to want to get into an argument with Francisco, so all of them approached the boy instead. They then helped him up and let him off after a few words of advice. Francisco turned around to look at Maisie. "Little goddess, why are you here at the hospital?" Maisie threw the question back at him. "I can ask you the same. I came with my mother. She's not feeling too well." "Little goddess, are you not feeling well either?" Maisie shook her head while Kennedy caught up to them. "Uncle Kennedy, I'm sorry, something just happened, and I got held up." Maisie handed the lemon tea in her hand to Kennedy. Kennedy grabbed the can of lemon tea and looked at Francisco, who was standing beside her. "And who is?" Francisco sounded modest and courteous. "Hi sir, my name is Francisco Boucher, and I'm a friend of little Maisie." Kennedy nodded. Samantha appeared at this time. She was stunned at first when she saw Maisie and Kennedy, but then laughed. "It's you. Mother, do you know them?" Francisco looked shocked. Samantha was surprised as well. After all, even her son knew them too. After Samantha's explanation, Francisco finally knew that his mother was Kennedy's savior and that Kennedy was his little goddess's uncle. Kennedy and Samantha had only met each other once the other night, but the two of them became very acquainted after meeting each other again today. Maisie and Francisco walked behind them while they were chatting with each other. That was when Francisco approached Maisie and whispered, "Little goddess, my mother and your uncle seem to make quite a match." Maisie chuckled and lowered her voice. "Now that your mother and father are divorced, you'll hold on to any way that can get your mother back onto the market as her son?" Francisco crossed his arms as if he was upset as soon as Maisie mentioned his father. "That's because my father doesn't know how to cherish her. A good woman like my mother deserves a better man." It happened that he spoke a little too loudly, and the two walking in front of them managed to hear it, so Samantha turned around and glared at him. "I can't make you keep your mouth shut now, can't I?" Francisco got behind Maisie, smiled, and said, "Little goddess, please protect me." Maisie glanced at him and laughed out loud. "But aren't you the little devil who fears no one?"